Hey, welcome back to the Ready State. I want to spend a second and talk about low back pain. Not in the terms of biopsychosocial model or sensitization, but as a mechanical structure. Because as we've expanded our conversation around the nuances of low back pain, one of the things that is clearly true is that we have braced the crap out of the trunk for the last decade or so, and we've worked on core stability, motor control, and guess what? Hasn't given us sort of the results that we're after. Now, we appreciate that the spine is a very complex structure inside a very complex environmental demand, but I want you to appreciate that your spine does not exist by itself, nor does it derive its stability by itself. What am I saying? Your spine is part of a system. And in this situation, I'm talking about your lumbar spine, that's contiguous with your pelvis and contiguous with your femurs. So if we're not looking at hip range of motion, if we're not looking at how the leg is articulating with the pelvis, then we only really have maybe 50% of the conversation or 50% of the information about why our back may or may not be functioning at its limit. So here's the idea. I'm sitting down for a reason, and that is when I sit down, I'm sitting on my pelvis. I'm sitting on my ischial tuberosities. And I want you to appreciate that I don't have a lot of leg involvement here. And so what ends up happening is that if I am not considering what's going on with the pelvis and the femur relationship as part of understanding this greater kind of context around the lumbar, that the lumbar is going to have to derive all of its stability organically via the pelvis, lumbar, musculature, and connective tissue systems. So when I sit down, I don't have a lot of options. And so I'm going to have to either stiffen the trunk appropriately or balance back and forth. And what ends up happening is that we fail to appreciate that it's not just this forward, back, side to side, pelvis, trunk relationship that matters, but it's also how this system derives its stability through the hip and the femur. Now, what I'm talking about is that we know that the hip and the femur has a chirality to it. It's wound up, it's designed, the structure is such that when I stand with my feet straight, there's always a passive rotation force built into the system. This is why when you lay down on the beach, your legs fall out, right? Because that system is unwinding. And why one of the things that we do when we stand forward and stand up with our feet straight is we automatically begin to capture some of this passive mechanical stabilization. So it's more effective or more appropriate for us to think about the pelvis lumbar as a system that creates and generates a lot of stability through this rotation of the pelvis. And so if we're not looking at what's going on in terms of our ability to create rotation through the pelvis, through the femur, then what we're left with is a system that's hunting for positional tension or positional stability. And one of the ways that we'll do that, well, it's by either defaulting here or defaulting here. Now imagine if I said to you, even structurally, I was like, hey, you have some knee pain, I understand. And you're like, yes. And I'm like, it's weird how your quads attach right to your patella when you have knee pain. You're like, of course they do. My patella is part of the quad system. Well, what if I told you that you have structures that go from your spine directly to your femur? And so one of the keys here is that if we're not assessing range of motion of the hip, if we're having any conversation about dysfunction or loss of position or loss of force tolerance or ground reaction force or our inability to handle axial load or whatever language you want to use, and we're not also looking at what's going on with the pelvis femur relationship, then we're always going to play catch up on the spine. And what we can do is certainly get the spine to be desensitized, but ultimately pain is not our goal. Our goal is not to set the bar with pain, no pain. Our goal is to set the bar of, do I have full access to my physiology? Am I creating an anti-fragile, robust system, yes or no? Which means that if I'm missing rotation or missing hip extension, man, that could drag the pelvis into one being pulled forward. But also, if I don't have the ability to rotate the femur, if I don't have the ability to create a stable system through here, through range of motion, and I end up dumping a lot of the rotation through compensation, then my spine pelvis is left in the woods. It's left in the breeze. It's left to try to derive that stability itself. So one of the reasons that we always assess flexion and extension and the rotational capacities of the hip when we're looking at the lumbar is not just that the tail sometimes wags the dog, but that in order for my pelvic floor to work, in order for me to derive stability through that system even, I have to appreciate that this rotation through the femur matters. It's not just about can I place my foot down in a whole bunch of positions. There's a reason that the hip has a rotator cuff of 6 rotators. Your shoulder has 4, your hip has 6, because so much of the pelvis stability is derived off of the relationship between the femur and the pelvis. So as you're helping people, or you're managing your own back pain or your symptoms or your low back dysfunction, however you want to talk about it, it is worthwhile to spend time practicing developing this relationship and the isometric control and the rotational control of the femur, which means I do step-ups and I do squats and I work on creating stable rotational structure relationships from femur to pelvis. That way, it's not always just about abs and TA and oblique and, come on, we have to be seeing these things as a relationship. Do not speak of the lumbar without speaking of the pelvis and the femur. When you start to add that back in, suddenly there's a lot of ways we can improve the system. And remember, it's probably not one thing, it's multiple things. But if we're not keeping our eyes on the true idea of function and output, we'll always be playing press and guess and catch up. You got this.